I knew I had broken something between us the moment I said it. It's not necessary anyway. The words had come so easily, so casually, as if they were a passing thought. But they weren't. They were deliberate, a quiet rebellion against the weight of expectations I had grown so tired of carrying. Our 10th anniversary was supposed to be a milestone, something sacred, a celebration of the life we had built together. But the truth was that life had been crumbling for years, brick by brick, beneath the surface of routine and unspoken resentments. I couldn't remember the last time we truly looked at each other without seeing the past instead of the present. And so, when Ethan, my husband's best friend, my friend too, offered me an escape, I took it. Ethan had always been different from my husband. Where Daniel was methodical, controlled, and endlessly practical, Ethan was carefree, adventurous, the kind of man who lived in the moment rather than planning 5 years ahead. He was my husband's closest companion, but he was also the crack in the glass of our marriage, a temptation I had fought against longer than I cared to admit. The invitation came 2 days before the anniversary. "We're heading out to the lake this weekend," Ethan had said, his voice light, but his eyes holding something else. "It's been forever since you've joined. You should come." I had laughed it off at first. "You do realize what Saturday is, right?" He shrugged. "Yeah. But does it even matter anymore?" I hated how easily he saw through me. Hated how much that question lingered in my mind long after our conversation ended. By the time the morning of our anniversary arrived, my mind was made up. I left Daniel's carefully arranged plans untouched, ignored the neatly wrapped gift he had left on the kitchen counter, and instead packed my things for the lake. I didn't expect him to protest much. Daniel wasn't a man who begged. He wasn't a man who yelled or accused. He was a man of quiet disappointments, of silence that cut deeper than words. He simply stood there, watching me, his face unreadable, his brown eyes holding an exhaustion I had grown familiar with. "You're really going?" was all he asked. "Yes." A long pause. "Then don't expect me to wait up." I didn't. What I didn't anticipate, however, was the call from the guards just a few hours later. I was in Ethan's truck, the night air thick with the scent of the lake, the distant sounds of laughter from the other guys who had come along for the trip. I had been sipping on a cold beer, my body finally relaxed in a way it hadn't been in months, when my phone buzzed. "Mrs. Carter?" "Yes?" I answered, already feeling my stomach tighten. "We have a situation at the gate." I sat up straighter, glancing at Ethan, whose eyes flickered with something unreadable. "What kind of situation?" "Mr. Carter instructed us not to let anyone in late tonight." "Your husband's orders." A chill ran down my spine. "And?" I pressed. The security guard hesitated before continuing. "You and Mr. Hayes are currently at the entrance. He won't let you in." For a moment, I didn't respond. Then I turned to Ethan. "We have a problem." The hum of Ethan's truck engine filled the heavy silence between us. The headlights cast long, stretched shadows across the gravel road leading up to the gates of our gated community, a place that had always felt like a sanctuary, now reduced to a barrier I couldn't pass. I stared at the security booth ahead, the guard standing rigid, his face tense with discomfort as he avoided eye contact. The tall, iron gates behind him remained firmly closed, indifferent to the fact that I lived beyond them, indifferent to the fact that I was supposed to belong. But tonight, I didn't. He said not to let anyone in late. The guard's words echoed in my mind, sharp and deliberate. Daniel's voice was behind those instructions, cold and calculated. He wasn't just keeping strangers out, he was keeping me out. Ethan shifted in the driver's seat, his jaw tightening as he flicked off the ignition. The sudden silence felt deafening. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, reaching for the door handle. "Wait." I grabbed his arm, my fingers digging into his sleeve. My heart raced, not from fear, but from something uglier, shame. "Let me handle it." I stepped out of the truck, the gravel crunching beneath my boots as I approached the guard booth. The air was cool, crisp even, but my skin burned with humiliation. "Mason," I said, recognizing the young security guard. He looked barely out of college, the same kid who'd always waved at me with a polite smile whenever I drove through. Tonight, he couldn't even meet my eyes. "You know who I am. Open the gate." He shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the clipboard in his hand as if it held the answer. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Carter." Mr. Carter's orders were clear. No late entries without his approval. "It's our house," I snapped, the words tasting bitter on my tongue. "I don't need his approval to come home." Mason hesitated, his eyes darting between me and the gate. I could see the conflict in his face, but Daniel's shadow loomed larger than my authority. "Please call him," I finally whispered, my pride crumbling with each syllable. Mason nodded, lifting his radio to his mouth, his voice low and professional as he relayed the situation. The wait felt endless. Ethan had stepped out of the truck by then, leaning against the door with his arms crossed, his expression a careful mask of indifference. But I could see the tension in his posture, the tightness around his mouth. Finally, Mason lowered the radio and turned to me, his face pale. "Mr. Carter says." He cleared his throat, as if the words were too heavy. "He says you made your choice. The door you walked out of is the only one you can walk back through." My breath hitched. I blinked, trying to process the words, their finality sinking into my chest like stones. "Are you serious?" Ethan's voice cut through the silence, his calm demeanor cracking. He marched up beside me, his presence suddenly overwhelming. "This isn't some military compound. Open the damn gate." Mason stood his ground. "I'm sorry, sir. I have my orders." Ethan laughed bitterly, shaking his head. "Unbelievable." He turned to me, his face inches from mine. "What do you want to do?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. Because I didn't know. I had left home that morning believing I was in control. I thought I was making a choice, choosing freedom, choosing a moment for myself, away from the suffocating routine of a marriage that had long since lost its spark. But standing there, outside the gates of the life I had built with Daniel, I realized I hadn't chosen anything. I had run. And now I was locked out, not just of my home, but of the version of my life I thought would always be waiting for me when I was ready to come back. Without another word, I turned and walked back to the truck, my steps heavy, my chest hollow. Ethan followed, his silence louder than any argument. We drove away from the gates, away from the house where my husband waited, or didn't. I didn't know where we were going. But I knew there was no going back. The silence in Ethan's truck was suffocating. The road stretched ahead in an endless blur, the streetlights casting fleeting shadows across the dashboard. My fingers fidgeted with the hem of my sweater, my mind replaying Mason's words over and over. "The door you walked out of is the only one you can walk back through." Daniel had meant it. He wasn't bluffing, wasn't waiting for me to call him in tears, begging for forgiveness. He had shut the door behind me, locked it, and thrown away the key. And I had walked right into it. "Say something," Ethan muttered, gripping the wheel tighter. "Are we just going to drive all night?" "I don't know," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "Where else could I go? I couldn't go to my sister's, she would tear into me the moment she found out what I had done. My parents lived across the country, and even if they didn't, I wasn't ready for the look of disappointment I knew I'd see in their eyes. I had friends, sure, but every one of them was connected to Daniel in some way. I had nowhere. "We can get a hotel," Ethan offered, his voice steady, like he had already made peace with this reality. "A hotel," I repeated, almost to myself. Was this really happening? Had I really traded 10 years of marriage for a weekend at some roadside inn, with nothing but a duffel bag and a sinking feeling in my chest? "Unless you'd rather go back and beg," Ethan added. I stiffened, my pride flaring up. "I'm not begging. Good, he said, turning the wheel. Then we're getting a hotel. I wanted to protest, to tell him this wasn't what I meant, but I stayed quiet. What choice did I have? The house, the life I had taken for granted, was no longer mine. We pulled into the parking lot of a modest motel just off the highway. The neon vacancy sign flickered, its glow reflecting in the rain-speckled windshield. It was the kind of place people stayed when they were passing through, when they had no real destination. It felt fitting. Ethan killed the engine and turned to me. Stay here. I'll get us a room. Us? I looked at him sharply. 2 rooms, he corrected with an exasperated sigh. Jesus, Claire. I know what this looks like, but I'm not an idiot. I swallowed the retort on my tongue and watched as he disappeared into the lobby. The rain had picked up again, drumming against the windshield, each drop feeling like a reminder of how far I had fallen in the span of a single day. I thought about Daniel, about what he was doing right now. Was he sleeping soundly, relieved that I was gone? Or was he sitting in his chair by the fireplace, staring at the door, waiting for me to walk back through it? No. That door was closed. Ethan returned a few minutes later, handing me a key. Room 214. I got the one next to it. I took the key without a word, stepping out of the truck and into the cold night air. The wind bit at my skin, but I barely felt it. The motel room was small, simple, just a bed, a nightstand, and a cheap painting of a beach hanging above the headboard. I dropped my bag on the floor and sat on the edge of the mattress, staring at the wall. This was my life now. I had left my husband on our anniversary for another man. And now, instead of feeling liberated, all I felt was lost. I wasn't sure I had made the right choice. But I was sure of one thing. Daniel had made his. And there was no undoing it, the motel room was unbearably quiet. I sat on the edge of the stiff mattress, staring at the faded floral curtains that did little to block the harsh glow of the neon sign outside. The hum of the old air conditioning unit was the only sound, a constant low drone that seemed to underscore the emptiness pressing down on me. I had been here for hours, though it felt like days. My phone sat face down on the nightstand, its silence louder than any notification could have been. Daniel hadn't called. Not a single text. Not even a demand to know where I was. I told myself that's what I wanted, freedom, space. But the truth sat like a stone in my chest, I wanted him to care. I wanted to feel his anger, his jealousy, his heartbreak. Anything that meant I still mattered. But he had let me go without a fight. I stood up abruptly, the motion too sharp, like I was trying to shake off the weight of my own regret. Pacing the small room, I ran my hands through my hair, frustration boiling beneath the surface. I wasn't supposed to feel this way. I had made a choice to stop pretending that our marriage was anything more than a routine wrapped in a ring. So why did it feel like I had lost something I didn't even know I wanted to keep? A soft knock at the door broke through my spiraling thoughts. I hesitated, my heart leaping in my chest. For one fleeting second, I let myself believe it was Daniel. That he had come to drag me home, to demand answers, to show me that I was still tethered to something real. But it wasn't Daniel. It was Ethan. I opened the door just enough to see him leaning against the frame, a cheap plastic cup in his hand, the faint smell of whiskey clinging to him. His eyes met mine, dark and unreadable. I figured you could use a drink, he said, lifting the cup slightly. I stepped aside without a word, letting him in. He crossed the room and sat in the old chair by the window, his long legs stretched out, his expression casual, too casual, like none of this was heavy or complicated for him. You okay? He asked after a moment, his tone soft but not overly concerned. I hated the question. No, I wasn't okay. I was unraveling in a cheap motel room, wearing the same clothes I'd left home in, carrying the weight of choices I wasn't sure I was strong enough to bear. But I wasn't going to admit that, not to Ethan, not to anyone. I'm fine, I lied, sitting back on the bed. He studied me for a moment, then handed me the cup. I took a sip, the burn of cheap whiskey grounding me for a second. You don't have to pretend, he said quietly. I know this isn't easy. I laughed bitterly, shaking my head. You think? Ethan didn't respond right away. He just sat there, his gaze fixed on me like he was trying to read between the lines of my silence. You're not the only one who lost something tonight, he finally said, his voice lower now. I looked at him, really looked at him for the first time since we left the house. He wasn't as composed as he pretended to be. There was tension in his shoulders, a flicker of guilt behind his eyes. Daniel was your best friend, I whispered, the words tasting sour. Ethan's jaw tightened. Yeah. Was. The weight of that single word settled between us like a third person in the room. Was. Our choices had burned bridges we couldn't rebuild, not just in my marriage, but in the friendship that had once seemed unbreakable. Do you regret it? I asked before I could stop myself. Ethan didn't answer right away. He stood up, pacing to the window, staring out at the empty parking lot below. I don't know, he admitted softly. I didn't think that far ahead. Neither had I. We had been two people chasing something we couldn't define, mistaking distraction for connection, confusing desire with meaning. But sitting there, in the cold glow of that motel room, it was impossible to ignore the truth. This wasn't freedom. It was fallout. I didn't know what came next. But I knew nothing would ever be the same. I woke up to the thin, gray light of dawn seeping through the faded motel curtains, casting long shadows across the small room. My head ached, not from the cheap whiskey Ethan had brought the night before, but from the weight of everything I'd been trying to outrun. I was still wearing the same clothes, my body stiff from sleeping curled on top of the scratchy motel blanket. The room smelled of stale air, faint traces of alcohol, and something else, something I couldn't name but felt suffocating. I reached for my phone on the nightstand, half expecting to see a missed call from Daniel. But the screen was dark, lifeless. No texts. No calls. No notifications. Nothing. I stared at the blank screen, my reflection faintly visible in the glass, messy hair, dark circles under my eyes, a hollow look I didn't recognize. It was strange how quickly life could shift from familiarity to foreignness. Just 2 days ago, I was standing in our kitchen, sipping coffee Daniel had brewed, pretending everything was fine. Pretending I was fine. Now, I was here. A knock at the door startled me. Claire? Ethan's voice. I didn't answer right away. Part of me wanted to pretend I wasn't here, as if ignoring him could somehow rewind time. But reality doesn't work that way. I opened the door, and there he was, Ethan, looking too put together for someone who'd spent the night in the room next to mine. His eyes flicked over me, lingering for a second before he cleared his throat. I got coffee, he said, holding out a cardboard cup. I took it without a word, the warmth seeping into my cold fingers. We should talk, he added, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. I closed the door behind him, leaning against it for a moment before turning to face him. About what? I asked, my voice rough from sleep, or maybe from everything else. About what happens next. I let out a bitter laugh. I don't even know what's happening now. Ethan ran a hand through his hair, pacing the small room like a caged animal. We can't stay in this motel forever. I didn't plan on it. Then what's your plan, Claire? Because right now, it feels like you're just waiting for someone else to make a decision. His words hit harder than I expected because they were true. I hadn't thought beyond the escape. I'd convinced myself that walking out the door was the hard part, that freedom would feel like relief. But freedom, it turns out, feels a lot like being lost. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring down at the cup of coffee in my hands. I don't know what I'm doing, I whispered. Ethan stopped pacing, standing in front of me now. You're not the only one who's lost something here, he said, his voice softer. Daniel was my best friend. And he stopped himself, shaking his head. I never meant for this to happen. I looked up at him then, really looked at him. The lines around his eyes were deeper than I remembered, shadows of guilt etched into his face. But it did happen, I replied quietly. We sat in silence after that, the kind of silence that feels heavy, thick with all the things left unsaid. After a while, Ethan spoke again. Maybe we should go back. I felt my heart seize. Go back? To what? Not to fix things. Just to face them. The idea terrified me. Going back meant confronting Daniel, looking him in the eyes, and seeing the wreckage I'd left behind. It meant admitting that I'd broken something that couldn't be unbroken. But maybe that's what I needed. Closure. Or at least the illusion of it. I stood up, nodding slowly. Okay. Ethan grabbed his keys, and we left the motel room without looking back. The drive was silent, both of us lost in our thoughts. The closer we got to the house, the heavier the air felt. My chest tightened with every mile, my heart pounding in a rhythm that felt foreign and familiar all at once. When we finally pulled up to the gate, I felt a cold wave of dread wash over me. The gate was open. Wide open. And Daniel was nowhere in sight. The gate had always been a symbol of security, of separation between the world outside and the life Daniel and I had built within. But seeing it wide open like that felt wrong, unnerving, like walking into a house where the front door has been left ajar. Ethan pulled the truck to a slow stop, his hand tightening around the steering wheel. Neither of us spoke. We just stared at the open gate, the driveway stretching beyond it like a path we weren't sure we had the right to follow. Should we? Ethan's voice trailed off, the question unfinished because we both knew there wasn't a real answer. I swallowed the lump rising in my throat and reached for the door handle, my fingers trembling slightly. Yeah, I whispered. We're here, aren't we? The gravel crunched underfoot as we walked up the driveway, side by side but worlds apart. The house loomed ahead, its windows dark and lifeless, like the very walls were holding their breath. The same house where Daniel and I had spent 10 years of anniversaries, birthdays, fights, and reconciliations, each memory now buried under the weight of what I'd done. When we reached the porch, I hesitated. The door was unlocked. I glanced at Ethan, whose jaw was set, his eyes scanning the surroundings like he expected Daniel to jump out from the shadows. But there was only silence. I pushed the door open slowly, the familiar creak of the hinges sending a shiver down my spine. The house was eerily still. No lights. No sounds. Just the faint, lingering scent of Daniel's cologne mixed with something colder, an emptiness that hadn't been there before. Daniel? I called out, my voice trembling despite my efforts to sound composed. No answer. I stepped inside, my heart racing as memories flooded in with every glance, the framed photos on the wall, the keys still in the bowl by the door, the blanket Daniel always threw over the couch when he fell asleep watching TV. But none of it felt familiar anymore. Ethan followed closely behind, his footsteps heavy on the hardwood floor. Maybe he's not here, Ethan whispered, but the words didn't comfort me. I moved through the house, each room colder than the last. The kitchen was spotless, the coffee pot empty, and the note I had left on the fridge days ago, a simple reminder about groceries, still hanging there like a relic from another life. I made my way upstairs, my legs feeling like lead. Our bedroom door was half open. I pushed it gently, the soft squeak of the hinges breaking the silence. The bed was made. Too neatly. Daniel never made the bed like that. I stepped inside, my eyes darting around the room. Everything looked untouched, like no one had been here for days. But then I saw it, on the nightstand, right where Daniel used to keep his watch. A single envelope. My name written on the front. Claire. My hands shook as I picked it up. Ethan appeared in the doorway, his eyes narrowing when he saw the envelope. What is it? He asked. I didn't answer. I just opened it, unfolding the crisp white paper inside. Daniel's handwriting was sharp, deliberate, just like him. Claire. I thought about locking the door, about leaving it bolted so you'd feel what it's like to be shut out. But then I realized, what's the point? You were gone long before you left. I won't make this dramatic. You made your choice, and now I've made mine. I don't want to be part of whatever's left of us. There's nothing to fight for when the other person has already surrendered. Take whatever you need from the house. It's just stuff. The only thing that mattered here is already broken beyond repair. Don't look for me. I won't be waiting. Daniel. The words blurred as tears welled in my eyes, my breath catching in my throat. I sank onto the edge of the bed, the letter trembling in my hands. Ethan stepped closer, his face tense. What does it say? I didn't have the strength to read it aloud. I just shook my head, feeling the finality of Daniel's words settle over me like a weight I couldn't shake. He was gone. Not just out of the house, but out of my life. I thought walking out had been the hardest part. But it turns out, it's being left behind that really breaks you. I don't remember how long I sat there, staring at the letter. Daniel's words weren't cruel or angry, they were worse. They were final. Cold. The kind of words you write when there's nothing left to salvage, when the ashes are too far gone to even pretend you can find warmth. Don't look for me. I won't be waiting. They echoed in my head, louder than Ethan's voice calling my name, louder than the faint creak of the floorboards beneath his shifting weight as he stood silently in the doorway. I folded the letter carefully, my fingers trembling, and placed it back in the envelope as if somehow protecting it could change its meaning. But it was just ink on paper, a tombstone for a marriage I'd buried with my own hands. Claire, Ethan said softly, stepping closer. We should go. Go where? I whispered, my voice raw, unfamiliar even to myself. He didn't have an answer. Of course he didn't. There was nowhere anymore. I stood up slowly, the weight of everything pressing down on me like gravity had doubled. The house felt colder now, emptier, even though Daniel's things were all still here, his watch on the dresser, his jacket draped over the chair in the corner, his scent lingering faintly in the sheets. But the man was gone. And what was left behind wasn't a home. It was a hollow shell filled with echoes. I moved through the bedroom like a stranger, my fingers brushing over the familiar, our wedding photo on the dresser, the small crack in the mirror Daniel always said he'd fix but never did. I paused by the closet, staring at the row of his neatly hung shirts, the familiar fabric suddenly foreign. Ethan was still watching me, his face tight with something between guilt and frustration. Claire, this isn't helping, he muttered finally, his patience thinning. I turned to him, feeling a sudden, sharp surge of something I couldn't name. Anger? Regret? Maybe both. What exactly do you think would help, Ethan? My voice was sharper than I intended, but I didn't care. Do you have a plan? Because it feels like we've been stumbling through this mess with no idea what the hell we're doing. His jaw clenched, his eyes narrowing. You think I don't know that? You think this is exactly how I thought things would go? I laughed bitterly, shaking my head. No, I think you didn't think at all. The words hung in the air between us, heavy and true. Ethan looked away, his shoulders tense. He didn't respond, and I didn't push him to. What was there to say? I left the bedroom without another word, heading downstairs. The house felt like it was suffocating me, every corner filled with memories that no longer belonged to me. In the kitchen, I stopped by the counter where Daniel had left the gift he'd wrapped for our anniversary. It was still there, untouched, the ribbon slightly frayed at the edges from days of sitting idle. I stared at it for a long time, my fingers hovering just above the box. I didn't open it. I couldn't. Because whatever was inside wasn't meant for the version of me standing there now. It was meant for the woman Daniel thought I was, the woman I thought I was. But she was gone. I grabbed my bag from the floor, slinging it over my shoulder. "Let's go," I said to Ethan, my voice flat. We left the house without looking back. As we drove away, I glanced at the rearview mirror, watching the house shrink behind us, disappearing around the curve of the road. It didn't feel like I was leaving home. It felt like I'd already left a long time ago. I just hadn't realized it until now. The road stretched out in front of us, endless and empty, just like the space between Ethan and me in the truck. Neither of us spoke. The silence wasn't the kind that begged to be filled, it was the kind that grew heavier with every mile, thick with words unsaid and emotions we didn't know how to name. I stared out the window, watching the familiar scenery blur into nothingness, but all I could see was the house shrinking in the rearview mirror, the ghost of a life I'd set on fire. Ethan's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white against the leather. I could feel his tension, like static in the air between us. "Where are we going?" I finally asked, my voice cutting through the silence like a blade. Ethan shrugged, not taking his eyes off the road. "Does it matter?" I didn't answer because maybe it didn't. Nothing felt real anymore, not the road beneath us, not the memories swirling in my head, not even the man sitting beside me. When we finally pulled into a gas station on the outskirts of town, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement. Ethan killed the engine and sat back in his seat, exhaling a breath he seemed to have been holding for miles. "Do you want anything?" he asked, his voice flat. "No," I replied quickly, eager to be alone, even if just for a moment. He got out of the truck without another word, the door slamming shut behind him. I watched him disappear into the small convenience store, his shoulders tense, his stride quick. I was alone. Truly alone. The realization hit me harder than I expected. I thought leaving Daniel would feel like freedom, like a breath of fresh air after years of holding it in. But it didn't. It felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, staring into the abyss, realizing there's no safety net below. I reached for my phone, the screen lighting up to reveal nothing, no messages, no missed calls. I scrolled through my contacts, pausing when I reached Daniel's name. My thumb hovered over it, trembling slightly. I didn't know what I wanted, to hear his voice, to feel something other than this suffocating emptiness, or maybe just to prove he still existed beyond the cold finality of his letter. But I didn't call. I couldn't. Instead, I shoved the phone back into my bag and stepped out of the truck, the cool evening air hitting me like a slap. I paced the small parking lot, my thoughts racing. Every step felt heavy, like I was dragging the weight of my own mistakes behind me. I replayed every moment, every choice that had led me here, our anniversary, the words I'd said to Daniel, the way his eyes had looked right before I walked out the door. Ethan returned a few minutes later, a bottle of water in one hand, a crumpled receipt in the other. He didn't say anything as he climbed back into the truck, handing me the water without meeting my eyes. "Thanks," I muttered, though the word felt meaningless. We drove again, the silence settling back in, thicker this time. After what felt like hours, Ethan finally pulled over on a quiet stretch of road, turning off the engine. "We can't keep doing this," he said suddenly, his voice sharp in the stillness. I turned to look at him, startled. "Doing what?" "Pretending like any of this makes sense." He ran a hand through his hair, frustration etched into every line of his face. "We're driving around like fugitives, Claire. What the hell are we even running from?" I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "Maybe we're not running from anything. Maybe we're just lost." He laughed bitterly, shaking his head. "Yeah, well, we're doing a damn good job of it." I didn't know what to say because he was right. We sat there in the dark, the only sounds the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze and the distant hum of traffic miles away. After a long pause, Ethan spoke again, his voice softer this time. "Do you regret it?" The question lingered in the air, heavy and unavoidable. I thought about Daniel's letter. About the house. About the life I'd left behind. "I don't know," I whispered honestly. I think I regret not realizing what I had until it was already gone. Ethan nodded slowly, his jaw tight. Yeah. We didn't say anything else after that. Because there was nothing left to say, the next morning felt different, not because anything had changed, but because I had. I woke up in the passenger seat of Ethan's truck, stiff from sleeping in an awkward position. The sunrise painted streaks of orange and pink across the horizon, casting a fragile kind of beauty over the emptiness I felt inside. Ethan was already awake, sitting on the hood of the truck, staring out at nothing in particular. There was something about the way he sat, shoulders hunched, head bowed slightly, that made him seem smaller than I'd ever seen him before. Not the confident, easygoing man I'd once thought I knew. Just someone broken. Like me. I climbed out quietly, the door creaking slightly as I shut it. My footsteps crunched against the gravel as I approached, but he didn't look up until I was standing right beside him. Couldn't sleep? I asked softly. He gave a half-hearted shrug, his eyes still fixed on the horizon. Didn't feel like dreaming. I didn't know how to respond to that, so I didn't. I just stood there, letting the silence stretch between us, not as heavy as before but still filled with everything we didn't have the courage to say. After a while, Ethan finally spoke. Do you ever think about how different things would be if we'd just stopped? His voice was low, almost a whisper. If we'd said no to that first text, that first conversation that went a little too far? I stared at him, the words sinking deep. All the time, I admitted, my throat tight. Because the truth was, it hadn't started with some grand, life-shattering moment. It had been small choices, tiny cracks in the foundation of my marriage that I ignored until they grew wide enough to fall through. A conversation that lingered too long. A look that held too much meaning. A text sent late at night when I should have been asleep beside Daniel. Little things that added up until they weren't little anymore. I thought it meant something, Ethan said quietly, his gaze finally meeting mine. Us. I thought it was. I don't know. Real. I swallowed hard, the weight of his words pressing against my chest. Maybe it was real, I whispered. But that doesn't mean it was right. He looked away again, his jaw tightening, and I knew I'd hit something raw. But it was the truth. What we had, whatever it was, had been built on borrowed time and stolen moments. It had grown in the shadow of everything I was afraid to face. So, what now? He asked after a long pause. I didn't have an answer. I didn't know how to rebuild a life from the rubble of bad decisions. I think I need to figure that out on my own, I said softly, surprising even myself. Ethan's face didn't change much, but I saw it in his eyes, that flicker of understanding mixed with something like resignation. Yeah, he said quietly. I figured. We didn't say goodbye. I just gathered my things, slung my bag over my shoulder, and started walking. I didn't know where I was going, but for the first time since I left Daniel, I wasn't running. I was just moving forward. Hours passed as I wandered through town, the streets both familiar and strange. Every corner seemed to whisper memories of a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. Eventually, I found myself outside the coffee shop Daniel and I used to visit on Sunday mornings. The bell above the door chimed softly as I stepped inside, the warm scent of coffee and pastries wrapping around me like a fragile comfort. I ordered a cup of black coffee, Daniel's favorite, and sat by the window, staring out at the street. I thought about texting him, just to say something. Anything. But what do you say to someone you've broken beyond repair? I'm sorry felt too small. I miss you felt too selfish. I love you felt too late. So I didn't say anything. I just sat there, holding a cup of coffee that grew cold in my hands, letting the silence be the apology I couldn't find the words for. Because sometimes, there's nothing left to say. Only the weight of what's been done. And the things you can't undo. The coffee had gone cold long before I finally stood up and left the cafe. I didn't know what I was expecting to find out there, some sort of sign, maybe, a cosmic message that would tell me what to do next. But the world outside was indifferent. People moved along the streets, lost in their own lives, oblivious to the quiet disaster walking among them. I wandered aimlessly for hours, my footsteps guided more by habit than purpose. Every street held fragments of memories I wasn't sure I deserved to keep, places Daniel and I had laughed, argued, shared quiet moments that once felt eternal. Now they were just echoes, reminders of everything I'd undone with choices I couldn't take back. Eventually, I found myself back at the house. Not because I thought Daniel would be there. I knew he wasn't. His letter had been clear, he was gone, and he didn't want me to follow. But the house still stood like a monument to the life we'd built together, a life I'd abandoned without fully understanding what I was leaving behind. The front door creaked softly as I pushed it open. The emptiness inside was louder than I remembered, every corner filled with the absence of the man who'd once made this place feel like home. I wandered through the rooms slowly, like I was afraid to wake the ghosts that lingered there. In the bedroom, Daniel's watch was still on the dresser, his jacket still draped over the chair. I reached out, my fingers brushing the fabric gently, as if touching it could somehow bridge the gap between us. But it was just cloth. Just a jacket. The bed was made, too perfectly. Daniel had always been messy with things like that. The neatness felt like another message, one he didn't bother writing down, I'm not coming back. I sank onto the edge of the bed, the silence pressing down on me until I couldn't bear it anymore. I reached for my phone, scrolling through my contacts until I found his name. I stared at it for a long time, my thumb hovering over the call button. My heart raced, but not with hope, just fear. I tapped the screen. The phone rang once. Twice. 3 times. And then it went to voicemail. His voice filled my ear, calm and familiar, but distant in a way it had never been before. You've reached Daniel. Leave a message. The beep felt like a gunshot. I didn't speak. I couldn't. My throat closed up, my heart pounding so loudly it drowned out everything else. After a few seconds, the line disconnected, leaving me with nothing but the hollow ache in my chest. I tried again. And again. Each time, the same result. Eventually, I stopped calling. Instead, I wrote him a letter. I didn't plan it. I just found myself at the kitchen table with a pen in my hand and an old notebook in front of me. The words spilled out, messy and raw, unfiltered in a way I'd never allowed myself to be when we were together. Daniel. I don't know how to start this because I don't know how to end it. I could say I'm sorry, but those words feel too small, too empty after everything I've done. I could tell you I miss you, but that feels selfish, like asking for something I no longer have the right to want. I could tell you I love you, but I don't think that means anything anymore, not after I threw it away like it was something disposable. So I'll just say this. I was wrong. Not just about the choices I made, but about everything. I thought I was suffocating in our marriage, trapped by routines and expectations. I thought I needed something more excitement, more attention, more, whatever it was I thought I was missing. But it wasn't you I was missing. It was me. The version of myself I'd lost somewhere along the way, the part of me that knew how to be grateful for the quiet things, the steady things, the things that don't scream for attention but are the most important of all. You were one of those things. Maybe the most important. And I didn't see it until it was too late. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't even know if I deserve it. I just needed you to know that losing you wasn't the moment I broke, it was the moment I realized I'd already been broken for a long time. I just didn't want to face it. Thank you for loving me, even when I didn't deserve it. And I'm sorry for not being able to love you the way you deserved in return. Claire. I didn't know what to do with the letter when I finished it. I folded it carefully, slipping it into an envelope I found in the drawer. I wrote his name on the front, though I knew I had no address to send it to. In the end, I left it on the kitchen table, right next to the untouched anniversary gift he'd left for me. I didn't open it. I couldn't. Because whatever was inside was meant for a version of me that no longer existed. I walked out of the house for the last time, locking the door behind me even though I knew it was just a formality. Daniel wasn't coming back. And I wasn't either. Some doors, once closed, never open again.